The unrelenting grip of the law is an icy one, but thankfully it's pretty cool all the same. Please don't click off the video already. Ace Attorney Investigations Collection is right around the corner for all major consoles and PC, and thanks to the folks over at Capcom, I was given a sampler back in July. While a demo is available for the general public now to test out and see what they think, I know a good chunk of my audience have been curious for my thoughts on these games. You're still going to have to wait a good long while for any kind of giant retrospective about either of them, but I figured that I could do you the same favor Capcom did for me, a mini-sized treat to prepare you for greater things to come. For those of you not in the know, Ace Attorney Investigations is a spin-off duology of games which originally released for the Nintendo DS back in 2009 and 2011. The first of which was localized, but the second never hit Western shores. This has now been remedied with an HD remaster of both games, which, as you can guess, focuses on Phoenix Wright's brilliant Bishonen rival Miles Edgeworth. But even aside from being a swap of the typical protagonists, AAI has much more up its sleeve. That's what I want to briefly dive into here. So before we get into what makes the remaster so good, why don't we chat about why you should give these games a shot at all, huh? While investigation and trial has always been the typical flow of Ace Attorney, I'm sure there's been times where you just wanted to get to the action of confronting witnesses and pointing out contradictions, right? Well, AAI consolidates these two modes of gameplay into a synthesis of sorts. You take control of Miles Edgeworth on the scene of a crime alongside your trusty assistant to gather clues, talk to witnesses, and discover the truth. To do this, you have several methods of observation at your disposal. The observations Edgeworth makes can be linked together like jigsaw pieces, leading to new breakthroughs and discoveries, encouraging you as a player to not only passively receive evidence that you'll stitch together later, but proactively think about how that evidence paints a larger picture in the now. Although it is pretty funny to see Edgeworth himself describe this mechanic in the game.
Oh, so I just link one thought to another thought to reach a different thought.
Yeah, man, congratulations. You, a career prosecutor, just described how thinking works. You can also, just as in Rise from the Ashes and Apollo Justice, observe evidence in a 3D viewer to get up close and personal with it, leading to even more nitty-gritty details being unearthed for your deductions. Not everyone will agree with your assertions while you work your magic, though, which is where the arguments come into play. Arguments are much like your typical testimony and cross-examination sections from the mainline games, though they can be more frantic. Remember, you're not dealing with people who've had whole days to work out their story, you're dealing with people who are flying by the seat of their pants. This dynamic, combined with your position as a prosecutor narratively, helps make these arguments feel confrontational, like you're having a rivalry with the character you're in opposition to. This goes even further in the second game of the collection, Prosecutor's Gambit. Here you can engage in bouts of
mind chess.
Mind chess is similar to these arguments, but also have a very enticing undercurrent of trying to coax more information out of the person you're talking to. You can press on ahead aggressively, trying to argue them down, or you can realize when they're getting agitated and strategically let your foot off the gas, getting the opponent in your battle of wits more comfortable and more prone to let some crucial information slip. Knowing when to pursue which option is crucial in a mind chess match, as you're always on a timer and can't afford to let those precious seconds get away, lest your culprit do the same. It's very tense and probably one of my favorite gameplay additions to an Ace Attorney game that I've seen in some time. Gameplay elements aren't the only thing to applaud the Investigations games for, of course. Typical of this franchise, the soundtrack is fantastic, stacked with bangers that I can't help but tap my foot to every time I boot the game up. Even the title screen can keep me engaged for minutes on end, because it's tough not to let that sucker loop a few times before I even get into sleuthing. This is thanks to the fantastic talents of Yasuko Yamada and the returning Noriyuki Iwadare, who I shouldn't even have to talk up. This is the guy that composed Trials and Tribulations. We know we're in good hands. There's also the fact that the game features new arrangements for many of these tracks, which are fantastic. But if you're looking for the classics, you're always free to switch to them in the menu. No matter which you fancy, the included music box is a great way to revisit your favorites at any time, too. On top of everything else, the game is just a joy to look at. Character portraits are expressive and full of personality like all the previous games, and the actual meat of the aesthetics, a top-down RPG look, is an absolute blast. It almost calls a miniature diorama to mind, packed with visual details which make my brain sing and perfectly paint the vibe of the environments these cases take place in. The sprites are also great, packing a lot of great animation into what are pretty small pieces of artwork, all things considered. I have to also go out of my way to compliment Capcom for finally doing what I've been begging them to do for several of these ports now, adding an option to play with the original artwork. Yes, you can switch to the original pixelated DS art here, and not only do you get it with the character sprites, you even get the fuzzier, lower-res backgrounds too. This is such an appreciated inclusion for me, even if I do think it is funny that we finally got this option in a port which, at least in my opinion, has the best-looking remastered visuals of all of those previously released for Ace Attorney. Even so, it's great to have it, and if you sorely miss any particular piece of eye candy you've come across during the game, the included gallery also allows you to recall anything you've seen, along with some awesome concept art, which for my money is always worth perusing. Speaking of appreciated toggles, it's nice to be able to choose what spoken language you want for the voice clips, small as they might be. Being offered the opportunity to change the audio while keeping the text language of my choice isn't something I ever thought I'd get in an Ace Attorney game of this era, but it's cool nonetheless. If I do have a small nitpick about the port though, it's that the English voice clips from Investigations 1 do still sound crunchy in comparison to the rest, which stands out in comparison to Investigations 2 characters who had to have their lines recorded from scratch. It's not a deal breaker, and I understand why they'd want to preserve those classic Edgeworth clips, but I doubt it would have been too difficult to re-record a few lines for the sake of consistent audio quality. While we're talking nitpicks, I do think this game transfers over to one screen well enough for a port from the DS, but the lack of dual screens does become apparent at times, particularly in the investigation sections. I assume the touchscreen offered more pinpoint accuracy in some instances, where you're either pointing something out or scouring these packed environments, and the comparative precision of a regular game controller does occasionally lead to clumsily clicking on things I didn't intend to look at. Call it growing pains, I guess. Lastly but not leastly, I'd also like to point out the addition of a game feature which was introduced in the Apollo Justice Collection, Story Mode. Story Mode turns the game into more of a typical non-branching visual novel-esque experience. It strips out the decision-making and lets the computer proceed the story for you, allowing you to just sit back and enjoy the narrative. It's a cool feature, and I'm perfectly okay with it not being able to be used if you don't want to get specific gameplay achievements, but I do have a couple teensy-weensy issues with how it is implemented. For starters, choosing story mode is like enabling autoplay, meaning that the text proceeds on its own without any need for player input, an option which is available in practically every visual novel ever made. My biggest issue with autoplay options, however, has always been text speed. I typically read much faster than the autoplay scrolls, and I'm always left bored waiting for it. This has been remedied in most modern visual novels due to allowing the text speed to almost always be adjustable. Ace Attorney, however, has always been an interactive experience, and thus plays around with its text speed for dramatic purposes, changing it scene by scene for maximum impact. This means, somewhat necessarily, it's not easy to futz with the text speed, so time between messages proceeding to the next is almost always going to remain the same. I get it, but it is a death sentence for the feature as far as my curated experience goes. Furthermore, while I do appreciate the ability to switch between story mode and playable mode at whim, the game only allows you to do this in certain intervals. Trying to switch in the middle of a section will often have the game warn you that doing so means restarting the entire scene. You may wind up feeling frustrated if you got stuck on something, felt like letting the game take over, and then were told you would have to wade through a bunch of stuff you've already seen. The text skip feature thankfully still exists, but it is an asterisk on the ability worth noting. Putting it all together though, the Ace Attorney Investigations collection still winds up being far and away one of my favorite port jobs by Capcom in recent memory. Combining two great games, one of which wasn't even available officially in English until now, giving you lots of extra options for quality of life and accessibility, and letting you run wild with it. The shakeup of the typical series formula is a blast, the characters are as lovable as ever, and thank God they actually allow legacy characters to show up in these. The music is deliciously earwormy, and aesthetically, both games look great, oozing that same familiar charm with some pizzazz of its own to boot. If you're at all a fan of Ace Attorney, or even just mystery games in general, you'd be hard-pressed to find more bang for your buck right now. Thanks so much to Capcom for sending me a code and letting me try this one out, and be sure to try it out for yourself too with the free demo that is available now. The full game drops September 6th. But before I go, let me also thank some of my patrons, such as Serena Midori, Shogun DX, Friend of Dracula, Ali Oliver, Claire Meeboom, Bailey, Noelle Hadley, Joseph Adams, Wecon, MJL, Lord Omega 12, KDAC1, White Toast, Lay Fam, T, Saxon, 16 Crows in a Trenchcoat, Cass Reed, Indigo, Horsefry, CJ the Magic Goose, Niche Fish, JS, Phantom Falcon, Harley, Sad Boy Alert, Space Battery, Moiba Alsue, Big Yellow, Digimaniac 33, Sable Cowl, Elaine Allfelt, Sidra Hitching, Loftwing, Lord Ormagodin, Queen Elzyme, Waterbrat, Nicole Clark, Deviant Witch, Zero Enderborn, Daryl Alcorn, Bankpads, Clovercool, and Noah. Thank you everyone for your support during this extremely tough time in my life, and for being understanding of my somewhat necessary semi-hiatus. I promise more cool stuff is coming down the pipeline, but for now, I'll see you on the flip side. Peace.